The New Zealand Street Tramway. Yesterday's transport medium for a growing urban population, and one that became an essential part of our everyday life until it finally died one day in 1964. On the 7th of May 1862, in the small town of Nelson, a horse-drawn tram commenced a historic journey that would pioneer 100 years of tramways in New Zealand. It was called the Dun Mountain Bus and ran from Hardy and Trafalgar Streets to the port of Nelson and became the first street passenger tramway in New Zealand. It was also the first to cease in 1901. The horse-drawn tram became a familiar sight in many of the towns and cities of New Zealand for more than 5 decades. Riding above the rough, unsurfaced roads, passengers would sit facing each other. The tram would stop to pick up and set down passengers anywhere, on request. A number of horses was required to be changed during the day. Stabling, grazing, and a good supply of healthy horses made it a relatively expensive operation. But the horse trams were slow, and many of our city forefathers, proud to be living in such a technological age, opted for steam. These locomotives were small, compact, and shrouded all mechanical parts in fake carriage bodies. These mechanical substitutes were made more agreeable for the horses, but frightened the remaining animals. Nicknamed the steaming demons, these little machines poured out smoke, soot and cinders, which did not endear them to the general public. 2nd of December 1871 at Grahamstown near Thames saw the first steam-hauled tramway in the country. It was open for haulage of kauri logs to the Tararoo Wharf, so it was called the Tararoo Tramway. A few years later, August 1878, Wellington introduced steam trams too. Here, the machines were never accepted, and in particular, they were despised by the cabbies of the time. The locomotive's persistent hissing, echoing through the narrow streets, caused many an accident to occur. They soon grew into disfavour with the public too, and cabmen started obstruction tactics to cause the drivers to pull up. David Proudfoot of Dunedin, on the 7th of July 1879, started steam and horse-drawn services. Proudfoot quickly expanded his services to areas of North East Valley, South Dunedin, St Kilda and Caversham, which opened up these areas and improved the market value of sections. However, the ever-threatening opposition from the cabbies came to a head in December 1880 when Proudfoot's fleet was destroyed by fire, bringing the service to an almost standstill. As the months passed, new trailers were built and the steam engines, little damaged by the fire, were reinstituted. Many accidents followed, and Proudfoot sold his interest to the Dunedin City and Suburban Tramway Company in 1883. The council imposed heavy restrictions on the steamers, and in 1884 they faded from Dunedin for good, leaving old Dobbin to plod on. Cathedral Square, 1880, and the first service in Christchurch began. Hailed as a haven for steam, the city's wide streets didn't pose as much of a problem as those in other centres. However, they didn't get by without mishap. Number 7, while standing outside the Heathcote Arms Hotel early on a Sunday morning, erupted in a massive explosion, the boiler being hurled into the air and landing 30 yards away. The driver and guard, fortunately being elsewhere at the time, escaped being killed or even injured. Oddly, motor number 7 outlived all her sisters and survived even to the present day, where the little Kitson-built steamer can be seen at Ferrymead in Christchurch. The steam-hauled passenger car tram lasted in Christchurch well into electrification, to the end of World War I in fact, and several Kitsons survived to be reconditioned and kept for emergency in World War II. In the north, Auckland had settled on horse trams, and these plodded along into the 20th century. The steam tram eventually did come to the Queen City, but briefly and on the North Shore. The introduction of electric trams in other countries meant that vehicles of this revolutionary power would naturally follow to New Zealand. In October 1900, the first electric line in New Zealand opened between Roslyn and Maori Hill. At 20 miles per hour, such luxury to have a swift, quiet form of travel in this time, and described like sitting in a drawing room gliding along. The line was built for the Dunedin and Roslyn Tramway Company as a feeder to connect the town belt with the Rattray Street cable tram. The vehicles were built by J.G. Brill and Company of Philadelphia. With the success of this line, W.G.T. Goodman accepted a position on behalf of his company Noyes Brothers of Australia as city engineers for the Dunedin City Electric Tramway Corporation. In December 1903, the Dunedin City Tramway formally opened. Ironically, years later, Sir William Goodman returned to Dunedin to report on the electric and cable tramway systems. But the very lines that he had so keenly installed 40 years earlier would all be totally axed, including those marvellous little cable trams. Oh, Dunedin, what tourist dollars you have thrown away. On the 17th of November 1902, the man they called the Father of Auckland, white-whiskered Sir John Logan Campbell, took hold of the driving handle and said, "Success to the Tramways Company! May its cars never cease to run in the city of Auckland." Moments later, a procession of brand new electric trams surged forward amongst the cheers of thousands of spectators. Auckland was the first to go in for a complete electric tramway system, but the public service of the vehicles did not start until a week later, and they were all the more eagerly awaited by the public. The delay was due to the steamer Lingamite being wrecked on the Three Kings Islands. It was carrying 11 motormen from Sydney. 7 only survived, and it was decided to let these men rest after their ordeal. The Auckland Electric Tramways Company was owned by the British Electric Traction Company, which pleased the ratepayer since transport levies were not imposed by the council. Wellington, 1904, and engineers carried out the initial test run just before midnight. The double-decker tram was brilliantly lit and glided down a section of track from Newtown Tram Barn. By January 1905, the planned system was in full operation. Councillors rode all routes on the official night trip, and it was commented at the time that Wellington trams were the quietest of all. Christchurch was not to be outdone. The dainty hand of Mrs. W. Rees, wife of the Tramways Board's chairman, drove a double-decker through a ribbon stretched across the tracks to start the procession opening the Papanui line. Local manufacturer Boone & Company produced some of the tram bodies and featured kauri interiors rather than the maple of imported cars. Certainly, the electric tramcar had indeed opened up suburbia, and the leisurely pace of the late 1800s had gone for good. Steep hills bounded the two cities of Dunedin and Wellington, and this posed a problem in transporting commuters and also providing further development of these areas. A proposal was put forward that cable cars be used. George Duncan, a young New Zealand engineer, was responsible for the founding of the Roslyn Tramway Company of Dunedin, and in 1881, at 29 years of age, engineered the first cable tramway in the Southern Hemisphere. Duncan's proposals were based on a design of Andrew Halliday, an Englishman who built the world's first street cable car system in San Francisco. Most of Duncan's knowledge was gained by technical papers and experimentation when building the line. But a major problem facing the young engineer was how to haul cars up and around St. Joseph's Cathedral, a grade of 1 in 7.5 feet. Ingeniously, he devised the pull curve. A number of small wheels known as drum pulleys eased the wire rope cable around the curve and still allowed the car to grip. This remarkably inventive piece of engineering was thereafter employed on many cable systems throughout the world. The 3.5-inch circumference steel wire rope cable was endless and continuously ran in a tunnel beneath the road, being caught by a protruding arm from under each gripping car through a slot in the centre rail. The projecting arm had vice-type jaws which were operated by a large lever in the centre of the car. These jaws gripped the wire rope to provide traction for the car. The cable could be released at any time, relying on the vehicle's braking systems to stop them and, more importantly, hold them on the hill. The drivers were always known as grip men. The cable never stopped during operating hours and was driven by a stationary steam engine in the powerhouse adjacent to the depot. The cars were very open to the elements, and a cold, wet, windy day would soon sort out the persevering southerner. 2 different vehicles in use on the line were used to transport coal and water to the hilltop powerhouses to feed the hungry boilers. People would stop at the top and gaze in awe at the huge stationary steam engines panting away with their massive rods twirling, and listening to the change of the exhaust beat as a loaded car gripped the cable. Four days from the opening, on the 24th of February 1881, 14,000 passengers experienced the ride up to Roslyn. By 1900, 3 private companies serving suburbs of Roslyn, Mornington, Maryhill and Kaikorai were in operation. For visitors to Dunedin, the thrill of the ride on the cable cars was reckoned the 8th wonder of the world. Well, they've all gone now, axed mercilessly after the Second World War. Great condemnation about their future existence was argued in many a council meeting, but patronage had dropped off, and with better roads and the private motor car being more prevalent, they disappeared forever. Wellington, turn of the century, and the hills above Lambton Quay were just waiting to be exploited for suburban land. The major problem was the 500-foot 1 in 5 slope. With picks, shovels and barrows, a great engineering feat eventually came to an end. It was sheer hard work, tunnelling through ridges and spanning gullies. The Kilbirnie and Karori Tramway Company had been formed to build a funicular cable car system. And on the 22nd of February, they opened the line. Soon, the surrounding hills became active with settlers and the sites of select and elegant homes. The engine house, when first installed, was steam-powered, but was electrified in 1933 with the upsurge in commuting. Feeder motor buses were used. It's interesting to note that in 1902, 425,000 passengers commuted on this service, whilst in 1926, 2 million passengers were transported. In 1946, the Wellington City Council reserved the right to purchase the cableway, and it became an integral part of the city's transport system. Today, the cars are sleek, ultra-modern. The 486 feet takes only 3.5 minutes to travel. Workers, residents and university students mingle with visitors from around the world to rise from Lambton Quay to the summit to take in the panoramic views of New Zealand's hill-girt harbour capital. The great urban sprawl began as more networks opened, and even provincial centres like New Plymouth, Wanganui, Gisborne and Napier had tram lines. The most southerly street tramway in the world was opened in Invercargill in 1912, with lines to north and south Invercargill, Waikiwi and Georgetown. Another line was the steam tramway of Otatara, crossing the Waihopai Channel on a long timber trestle bridge to Duns Road. This was promoted by the Otatara Land Company to create a new suburb, but it soon failed and was passed over to the council for reclamation of the estuary. The east coast North Island town of Gisborne chose a system unique in New Zealand. The cars were powered by electric storage battery. Mayor W. Douglas Lismar successfully fought for the introduction of these small chocolate and cream trams after stormy battles with his council. In 1913, the system was opened, but lack of patronage on these lightweight trams gave ratepayers a heavy burden for years. Still, Gisborne did have something unique. They owned the first Edison battery trams in the Southern Hemisphere, no matter how slow they were and how much it was costing them. Napier's 3-foot 6-inch gauge tramways were destined to come to an abrupt and final halt with the great earthquake of 1931. A pity, for these trams were attractive and popular, and extensions to the system continued right through the 1920s. But trams were never restored when they cleaned up after the quake, for the town was nearly totally destroyed. The motor vehicle was becoming more affordable and abundant, and so it was decided to abandon Napier's trams forever. Two more of New Zealand's smaller towns could not deny themselves the glamour and progressive image that electric tramways could give them. Wanganui, in fact, began the trend. Way back in 1908, its four-wheelers first trundled off to Aramaho. And the last new electric tramway to open in New Zealand did so in New Plymouth, right in the middle of World War I, when Port Fitzroy was served from the town by 5 brand new tram cars. The great years of New Zealand's tramways were still to come. In the 20s, routes expanded in all major centres, accommodating the commuter and opening up new suburbs. Times were easier after the First World War, businesses boomed, and it was the trams that moved the masses. Tram cars were built to last, and system workshops were busier than ever. It always fascinates me when I look at this piece of film from 1925 of the big Manukau Road workshops in Auckland. To our eyes, an amazing lack of safety gear, but the job got done, and with pride too. The quality of work and dedication meant the spiffy trams rolled along their well-maintained tracks with clockwork-like reliability. designs differed from one town to the next. The boxy little saloons were commonly called dinghies because their swaying motion was like being in a small boat in a rough sea. Well, so it was said by some. Hong Kongs or toast racks. Now, these were open cars with the roof supported on wooden stanchions. The seats ran right across the car. Toast racks they certainly looked like. The conductor's job was a toughie. He had no option but to swing like a monkey along the outside of the car to collect his fares, and not a few men were swept off to injury or death. Dunedin's Yankee-built Brill cars, being four-wheelers with long overhangs, would bounce along the tracks at any great speed, and the locals called them jumping jacks, bobbers or galloping Gerties, on a polite day. When Aucklanders saw the scarlet-red pure London livery of four new tram cars rushed out by the company in 1907 to avert trouble with the City Council, the seaside residents immediately named them the Lobsters. Queen City routes were extended even further as its suburbs sprawled and population rose, and scenes like these were commonplace in the late 40s and early 50s. September 1954, Christchurch said farewell to its trams at Cathedral Square. There were few regrets. The trams were falling into disrepair. Local authorities were eager to move to motor buses. And also, more Kiwis had found a personal freedom of transport in the motor car. Further south, Dunedin's trams saw total closure in 1956. They were replaced by trolley buses on the main routes, with services to outlying districts by diesel and petrol buses. Dunedin trams then have faded into history, only to be remembered by those who rode them and the dedicated few who helped to save a few cars. And maintenance became increasingly hard on Auckland's ageing fleet, rattling round the suburban streets. Diesel and trolley buses were the new words in transport people's vocabulary. Rubber tyres, comfortable seats, and a bus that could travel almost anywhere. So the writing was on the wall for Auckland's graceful ladies. Track work, overhead wires and antiquated power plants would have to be replaced. The cost, phenomenal. The Auckland Transport Board decided to abandon its trams. If it seems to take a little longer for Wellington to make up its mind, remember that the smart fiducia trams were running sweetly. Maintenance had been kept up for several more years of viable operation, and the motorcar had not made the same impact as in other centres. Even so, Wellington's beauties succumbed to the usual fate, and on the 2nd of May 1964, the final journey from Thorndon to Newtown was the last time New Zealand saw trams on its streets. Graham Stewart founded the first preservation society in New Zealand for trams. He's also an author and historian for street tramways, and his books, When Trams Were Trumps, and the new revised edition of End of the Penny Section are simply marvellous memorials to the tramways of New Zealand.
Well, for one thing, a tramcar in New Zealand was a very personal thing to the city where it was domiciled. When you look at an Auckland tram, a Christchurch tram, Dunedin tram or Wellington tram, they were very much part of the city. When you look back on the tram cars, their designs, you'd only have to look at a street scene in those days and you'd say, that's Wellington or that's Auckland. And, you know, a visitor, say, to Wellington, either from Christchurch or Auckland, would look at the trams in Wellington. They were very different animals. And of course they were built very narrow compared with the other centres because of the narrow thoroughfares. But the tramcar, yes, it had its personality, which was related to that city, and they were built. To accommodate the special sort of requirements of those cities and of their streets.
For further information regarding Graham's wonderful books, write to Grantham House Publishing, P.O. Box 17256, Wellington. The days of the trams were over. The bodies used as beach houses, and some left lying derelict in paddocks. However, preservation didn't start in earnest until 1957, when Graham Stewart suggested to the Auckland Transport Board it would be logical to preserve car number 253, the sleek streamliner known to trammies as the Queen Mary. After all, old number 11 had been saved, so Graham formed a trust to preserve 253, and then a society was formed, the Old Time Transport League. In 1960, along with other societies, it became the Museum of Transport and Technology, or MOTAT. In the same year at Christchurch, John Shanks, along with a band of enthusiasts, preserved for prosperity Kitty, number 7, and the horse-drawn tram. These vehicles, stored outside without cover, soon deteriorated, so protection was provided for 5 years at the Transport Board's workshops before moving to Ferrymead Historical Park. Today, this complex has a full and extensive working tramway with many fine exhibits. Wellington's group was led by Bill Horn, and thanks to them, double saloons 151 and 207 were preserved. And with the enthusiasts' determination, fiducia trams number 235, 238, 239 and 260 were purchased from Wellington City Council. Today, another splendid electric tramway museum with these fine cars and many others in fully restored order can be seen at Queen Elizabeth Park north of Paikakariki. Another memorial to the great days of the New Zealand Street Tramway and the dedication of enthusiasts who refused to let it die.
I actually started driving trams in 1946 when I turned 21 years of age, 1946, and I only drove trams in Wellington for 4 years because I left Wellington in 1950 and shifted to Christchurch, but I then joined the Christchurch tramway workshops. I worked in the tramway workshop doing maintenance and so on, but I was also their electrical tester that took the trams out for testing after repairs and maintenance, and also their trolley buses. The trams in Christchurch I never got to drive too far because I used to just go up and down Morehouse Avenue. But the actual trolley buses, of course, I had to go to the nearest loop, which in most cases was right out at the terminus at any rate, so I used to go out to North Beach, anywhere where there was a loop where I could come back again. And then the diesel buses, because of brake testing and that, I had to take them up Cashmere Hills. So I used to drive them up Cashmere Hills and back again, so I got a fair sort of run on the trolleys and the diesels. But the only time that I did any long distance work with the trams was when there was any major breakdowns. And one big one I remember was a head-on collision in the fog coming in from a tram coming in from Sumner and one going out the other way. The young motorman was supposed to wait at the loop for the incoming express from Sumner, which had a couple of trailers on, and the fog was very thick right down to the rails but he was running early and he thought he could make it to the next loop, but unfortunately he didn't, and it was quite a mess that we had to go out in the breakdown tram and with arc welders and all that, and cutting tools and so on to break up the mess and take it all back. Yes, he made quite a mess. There was no one killed, fortunately, but it was quite a nasty. The trailers telescoped and that, and but that was when I had a real good run on the tram, was going out in the breakdown wagon. But the rest of my running was just up and down Morehouse Avenue in the trams.